So as I was saying, you have to make sure that the ethical standards were maintained, like confidentiality, the comfortability of the people to answer, that they did not answer under duress, those kinds of things. And then completeness is to ensure that all the questionnaires were answered, the responses were sufficient. Like if it is a question, it was answered, there are no gaps. There are no questions that had gaps, okay? And you can actually do this completeness of, basically completeness, and these are just elements, especially in data collection, like especially if you are giving people an online questionnaire, just ensure that somebody cannot go to next question if they have not actually answered the first one. All right, like the way we do for your exams, we do not allow you to, like sometimes we may require you to do what, we may require you to answer the question. Like you cannot go to the next question if you've not provided at least something, at least an answer for a question. So that is completeness. And the other one is data editing. This is phase 2 of data analysis. So you have data validation, data analysis, then you have phase 2 of data analysis, which is data editing. Data editing is where the researchers have to confirm that the provided data is free of errors. And what are these errors? You know, sometimes a research sample comes loaded with errors, and respondents sometimes fill in some fields incorrectly or sometimes skip them accidentally. So data editing is ensuring that there are no, what we call, the questions have not been, some questions have not been skipped, and that really fits well with completeness. Okay, questions have not been skipped, and also people have answered the right, they have provided the right answer. If they were required to enter a value, they have not entered text, they have entered a value. And it's very good, especially that can very well be implemented when you are having an online questionnaire. You can require student, the question, the respondents to enter only text, or enter only number, or enter only up to 100 words if it's an open-ended questionnaire, right? So that is basically editing to ensure that they have actually provided as given, okay? Meaning that from 100 words and above, you're not going to be reading that, okay? So you conduct those necessary checks. Then the phase 3 of analysis is coding, data coding. Now in data coding is the last phase in analyzing quantitative data. And this is where you use tables and Excel sheets now to represent that data. So you have an Excel sheet. So in you create columns and rows, yeah? And you fill those particular columns and rows depending on the questions that you gave people, okay? So you fill those columns and rows with data, and then now you can select the columns and rows, particular columns and rows, and you generate what? You generate Excel graphs or Excel charts. That is basically what data coding is about, and it's the last one. Now this is the one which you're going to be doing so much, all right? And when you have your supervisor, your supervisor is going to help you to analyze your data, okay? To show you how to analyze. So most of these things, I'm just going through them theoretically, because of course the questions in your exams are going to be theoretical in nature. But when you get to project writing and research project, when you are doing your project, you're going to be required to write a documentation, okay? So in the documentation, now these things are going to come in very, very live, and you're going to do them practically, okay? And that's why you'll have supervisors, because they'll be helping you to do some of these things. Now, how do we conduct quantitative research? There are methods of doing quantitative research. Methods of doing analysis for quantitative data. There were methods we used for analyzing qualitative, and we had what? We had content analysis, narrative analysis, discourse analysis, and grounded theory. Then, there are also methods for analyzing. There are methods for analyzing quantitative data. So what are those methods? There's descriptive statistics, measures of frequency, and measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion or variation, and measures of position. Okay. And also we have inferential statistics. Okay. Let's go through them and see what they are about. So measures of frequency is where you are measuring things that these are things you learned in mathematics. You are measuring things like count, total, percentages, and frequencies. Okay, basically measures of frequency is used to basically analyze how often does a particular thing occur. Okay, how often does a particular thing occur? Okay, so researchers use it when they want to showcase the often-ness of a response. How many times have respondents answered the same way? Okay, the frequency. So it's called measures of frequency. All right, like you can say out of 50 people, 40 answered yes. Okay, that's a measure of that's a measure of frequency. Okay, how often has a response been given? Okay, then there is measures of central tendency. Measures of central tendency is basically things to do with mean, median, and mode. Okay, measures of central tendency, when you're analyzing, it's basically where you're trying to demonstrate the distribution of various points and where you want to show the most commonly or the average responses. So if you want to look at by average, on average, how many people answered, by average, how many people bought, on average, how many people bought online during COVID-19 pandemic, or they bought or they chose to buy online instead of buying physically. When you're looking at the average of that, you're basically doing a measure of central tendency. Okay, so measures of central tendency are just things to do with mean, median, and mode. You normally deal with median and mode, especially when you are dealing with experimental research, where you want to see out of the different readings that you got. Like if you are measuring how long does it take to liquefy solid mercury. So the first reading was 0.3, 1.2 minutes. The other one was 1.3 minutes. The other one was 1.25 minutes. The other one was 1.35 minutes. The other one was 1.24 minutes. So you remember how to take median. Median is basically taking the middle position. Okay, yeah, that's just it. And you remember mode? Yeah. So basically, especially median and mode, they are used with your research was experimental in nature. Then there is what you call measures of dispersion or variation. Measures of dispersion is where the researchers use this method to analyze how data is spread out. It helps them identify the depth until which the data is spread out that it directly affects the mean. Yeah, like the range, the variance, the standard deviation. Of course, you're not going to use standard deviation in your coming projects, right? Because you're not a mathematics, your concentration is not mathematical in nature, it is IT. But range and variance, these are some things that may come in handy when you're writing your documentation, okay? Then, so these measures of dispersion, then there's measures of position. Measures of position is where we are talking about percentile ranks, quartile ranks. So basically, measures of position just helps us to know the percentages of occurrences or the percentages of things being tested. Okay. All right, then we go to measure inferential statistics. Inferential statistics are used to make predictions. Okay. For instance, researchers use inferential statistics on a sample to reason out that about 80 to 90% of the people like the movie. Okay, so basically this is basically an inferential statistic. An inferential statistic is what you make out of data. Yeah, like, and normally it deals with percentages. So you can actually say that measures of frequency, like the percentage and also the count. The count is the total. Totals and percentages can also be used together with inferential statistics, where you say 80% of the population preferred online buying to physical buying during the COVID-19 pandemic. 20% of the people preferred physical buying to online buying during the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are basically inferential numbers, okay? Inferential. And inference is basically like a conclusion, okay? That is made from percentages, okay? So there are those. So there are methods for analyzing qualitative data and methods for analyzing quantitative data. So those are the methods that are used to analyze quantitative data: measures of frequency, measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion, measures of position. And I'm going to share these notes so that you can also read the in between the lines. I'm basically giving you the overview so that you can understand what each is about. Okay, so that is what we have. That is what we have now. What are some of the things that you have to consider when doing data analysis? The first thing is that the researcher must have the necessary skills to analyze the data. You need to have the skills. You need to know how to analyze. So you need, for instance, if it is measuring the mean, you need to have some background in mathematical knowledge, right? Where you can actually calculate the mean. The mean is the count divided by the number of items, right? Yeah. So you need to have at least some necessary basic skills for analyzing, depending on the method of analysis you are using. So if you are doing measures of frequency, at least you have to know how to calculate percentages. This over this times 100. This over that times 100. If you are doing measures of dispersion and you are calculating range, at least you have to know those methods, those formulae that are used to calculate. Okay, so number one thing that you have to consider when doing data analysis, that you need to have basic skills for analyzing the data. Okay, then you have to apply scientific discipline. Okay, you have to apply scientific discipline. Scientific discipline means that you have to apply some systematic procedure before the analysis. So of course, you have to know how to choose samples, how to collect data. Yeah, you remember the process of data collection, the stages of data collection. So those stages, because every scientific venture is procedural in nature. Scientific ventures are not haphazard; they follow some specific procedures. So at least you need to have that scientific discipline, that before you get to analysis, you have actually collected data. You have actually you did actually choose samples. From those samples, you collected data using the different data collection methods, and also ensuring some ethical and professional standards are maintained, right? And after that, now you can analyze. In other words, you must observe scientific discipline, the steps before you analyze. All the other things prior to analysis must have been done. Why? Because you cannot analyze data you've not collected, and you cannot collect data if you did not choose samples, right? Yeah. The other thing is that you must be able to, the motive behind data analysis is to present accurate and reliable data. Therefore, avoid statistical and mathematical errors, especially when you are calculating measures of frequency, measures of central tendency, measures of position. Yeah. So ensure that you avoid those kinds of errors. Yeah. And also the other thing is that you should be able to use easy tools. Do not use tools for analysis that you are not aware of. For instance, that is why I've recommended that for production of pie charts and bar graphs and line charts and column charts and all those kinds of charts and graphs, use Excel. Excel is the easiest and it's the one you've been taught. Otherwise, for people who do accounting, there is the tool called SPSS for analysis. Okay, but you don't need it if you are not conversant with it. So use the other factor to consider is that you have to use tools that you are actually aware of, or you are actually able to use. Tools that you're able to use. Okay. Then let's look at something called conclusions or findings and recommendations. Conclusions, findings, and recommendations. Now, conclusion is basically, just a minute. A conclusion is basically what you infer after analysis. A conclusion is what you infer after analysis. So after you analyze data, if it was data about the impact of COVID-19 on e-commerce, then there are conclusions that you make. Now those conclusions are things you have learned from all the data you've collected and analyzed. You can say that more people prefer during this season of the pandemic to buy things online. That's a conclusion you're making. Okay. And you can actually add flesh to that particular conclusion. You say that this is because of the fear that most people have said, that they fear exposure to the virus, or they don't want to expose those they live with, who especially are young individuals, and others are elderly individuals that live with them. So those are conclusions you are making from what you have collected. Now, conclusions, something about conclusions, they should not be researcher biased. Okay, they should not be researcher biased. In other words, you're not concluding what you think, you are concluding what you found out from the research, from the data people have given you. You don't enforce your bias, enforce your preference to doing conclusion. When you are making conclusions of your research, you're just saying, this is what I found out, this is what I found out from my research, and they need to be accurate. And also, the conclusion must be done in definitive statements. Okay. Don't use such terms as maybe, probably. Yeah. Don't use such terms as maybe, probably. They need to be definitive and authoritative. In other words, they communicate exactly what is a view you have arrived at from collecting and analyzing data. It's a view you have arrived at from collecting and analyzing data. So you're not trying to say probably people are not buying more. No, you are not giving room for guesswork or preference or bias. You are basically declaring. Okay, so the statements should be definitive, they should be authoritative, they should be declarative. Okay, right? When you say that most people have preferred this because of this and this and this. Okay, very declarative statements. Okay, those are conclusions. And they also call findings, what you have found. Then recommendations. Recommendations are basically suggestions. Recommendations are suggestions you make for the improvement of that area of research as communicated by the respondents. So you can make recommendations like you can recommend that e-commerce sites should have more products, not just the electronic products, but even the mundane kind of products like grocery, like things that people use every day, right? Grocery, bread, bakery things. Because during the COVID-19 pandemic, people want to just buy things online. So you can just recommend things from the information you've gotten. You make recommendations that can actually facilitate the people's preferences. Okay, such kind of things. So recommendations are suggestions you make, and they have to be informed from the research. They also should not be biased. Okay, they have to be informed from the research. All right. Then after you all of these things now have to lead us into what we call report writing. Okay, report writing. Now let me share a screen here so that we can go through report writing together. Okay, so all these things that you've done in your research, you now have to compile them in a documentation. Okay, and produce a report. So let me share a screen here which can enable us to go through report writing together. Just a minute. So report writing, what is a report? The first thing to understand about a report is basically a final documentation that you prepare and produce after a research. And a report contains all the vital elements of the research, which includes the activities you performed during the research from start to end, from beginning to the end. A report is basically, you are basically, from the word report, you are reporting what you did. Right? So the report is basically a final documentation you normally prepare after you are done with doing your research, collecting samples, collecting data, analyzing data, and all that, and also making conclusions and recommendations, which you've been writing in different documents. So a report is now the final document that you prepare, and it communicates what you have done throughout your research, and probably your challenges and experiences during your research time. So a report for you is what we call the scholarly documentation. When you are doing your project, you're going to write a documentation or prepare a documentation. So that documentation is what we call a report. It contains everything concerning the project you have just written and everything you did concerning the project, data collection, literature review, all of those things. It's called a documentation, and it's a type of a report. Okay, why do we need a report? Why do we need a report? A report communicates all the important elements of a research. That is basically why we need a report. It communicates the important elements of a research, right? And that report can also be presented to people that are that require it. For instance, if you are doing a research for an organization, that organization will require a report back. So that report can also be used for reporting, just that reporting. Okay, just a minute. Just a minute here, trying to look for something here. All right. So why do we write reports? Because a report gives a comprehensive feedback. It gives or communicates. It gives a comprehensive feedback on what happened during the research period. Okay, and it also helps us to communicate to people that require that report, like an organization, like a school, right? So it gives a report back to people who actually need it. Now, what should we do for us to basically prepare a report? How do we prepare a report? Okay. How do we prepare a report? Now, the first thing to do when you prepare, as you are preparing a report, is to first review the subject that you are discussing. Basically, to look at what is the subject you are discussing, then prepare the a rough draft of the report, then correct the draft, then produce the last or the final report. So there are three key things to do when you are preparing a report. The first thing is to analyze or to understand the subject you are researching on. Go through the subject you are researching on. Look at whether everything you've been doing throughout the research is related to that the subject, or you did some other things, and then prepare a rough draft, correct that draft, and then produce the final report. Now, the layout, the research report normally has particular elements, okay? For instance, your documentation will have some specific things, okay? How your research should look like. And this is the important thing about research, the report, what should your report have, okay? Now, let me get some content here. Let me get some content here from some of the work that I prepared to show you the particular elements or the parts of a research, which is actually your documentation. How should your documentation look like when you're doing your research, right? It's called a trade project research format. So a trade project research format, let's see what is happening here. All right, let me share the screen. Okay. So there are different elements of your reports. How should your reports look like? So for instance, in the project that you're going to do, yeah, or some of you are already in semester 4, there's a project you are doing, or DSC semester 5. There's a project you're doing, and in that project, DCS 2.2, DSC 2.2, you're going to do a project. DCS, I think you're already doing a project already. You're being taught by Mr. Titus how to do your project. Now, when you're writing your documentation, these are particular elements of your report or your documentation. The cover page. The cover page is that it contains the name of your details, your personal details, okay? The title of the research, the name, your admission number. Statement of fulfillment is the one, if you've read some of these research projects from your previous students, friends, normally see a statement like, this research project has been submitted in partial fulfillment for the award of a diploma in computer science by ZTech University. That is basically what it called a statement of fulfillment. Then submission date normally comes below, somewhere at the bottom of the cover page. Then you have preliminary pages. Preliminary pages, now that's why you have things like declaration. These things you're going to be taught in the project, okay, in the project things. Declaration, acknowledgement, dedication, table of contents, list of figures, list of tables, abbreviation and acronyms, abstracts. Yeah. So this particular, let me confirm something here. These particular ones in the report, we can actually say that these two areas, cover page and preliminary pages, we can say that these are the preliminary pages of a report. Are we together? So we have the preliminary pages. Preliminary pages are basically pages that come before the main text, okay? Before the main text or the preliminary content. Like if you're writing a letter, you have the body where you are now communicating the main message of your letter. But then you have where you indicate your address, to whom are you writing to, recipient's address, these kinds of things. Those are preliminary text, all right? So preliminary is what comes before, okay? So these are preliminary pages, okay? So cover page and preliminary pages are preliminary pages, okay? Then we have the second part. This is called the main text. Are we together? This is called the main text, all right? This is called the main text, your body. This is the body of the research, and it's called the main text or the body of the research, okay? The main text. And it includes things like chapter 1. Again, I'm not going to go into what each of these is, because for those who are doing project, or those who, of course, there are others who are going to do project next semester, you're going to be going through for documentation, all this, okay, together with your supervisor. So your supervisor will show you most of these things. But for you, for now, because your content is going to be tested theoretically, you'll be asked, for instance, what are the parts of a report? Okay. So for you, you're going to say preliminary pages. So I'm trying to show you now in a documentation which they are. Then main texts. In your documentation, main text includes things like chapter 1, where we have all this. Chapter 2, literature review. But then look at your cut 2. There is something I asked you to research on concerning this, okay? In secondary data collection, things like citation and referencing. So look at that up. Anyway, we have chapter 3, did you collect data? That's data collection. Chapter 4, how did you analyze and interpret data? All right, chapter 5, how discuss that data you have analyzed. Then chapter 6, findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Then when we come here, this is what we call part 3 of a report. It's called end matter. Okay, end matter. So there are 3 basic parts of a report: preliminary pages, the main body or the main text, and the end matter. The end matter contains things like references, appendices, Gantt chart. Gantt chart is what? It's the Gantt chart is basically a table of how you divided your activities in different time slots. Okay, again, those are things you're going to be taught in detail when you're doing your project, okay, by your supervisor. But end matter are basically things that end your report. For instance, if you're writing a letter, the end matter is normally your as you sign off, all right? Kind regards, or yours truly, or yours sincerely, or yours faithfully. That is called end matter. So end matter in your report are things that end your report. Okay, and they include references and appendices and all those kinds of things. If you have pictures that you need to include, you include them there. Okay. So that's basically what end matter is about. So that is it about report writing. And actually, report writing is actually the end of our research, the end of our content, the end of our unit. So, any questions? Any questions? So that basically brings us to the end of our unit. I can see we have less than 1 minute remaining. So let me give the final remarks. Your CAT 2, your assignment 2, your assignment 1 have been uploaded in the portal. So if you have access to the portal, you are able to do that work. CAT 2, assignment 2, and assignment 1. All right. And they are going to give you a guide. It's a guide of everything that you are supposed probably to know and to learn. Things that I probably told you in class, research about this, they are all included in those works. And they have deadlines. So see the portal to see the deadlines. And then I'm going to upload all the notes, including these ones that I've used for demonstration in the portal, so that you can look at them. So meanwhile, your exams start in 17th, sorry. So from next class, we are not going to have our class because this marks the end of our units. Okay. So have yourselves a good time, revise. The notes are going to be in the